Terms pertaining to the three characteristics, tila kana. The Pali term tila kana, three characteristics, is familiar to many students of Buddhism. This is not an original term, and it does not appear in the Tipitaka. Rather, it became a popular term in the commentaries. In the Tipitaka, the three characteristics are referred to as the three laws of nature, Dhammachaka, and there is no collective term for these three factors. Although they are described in many different formats, they are mentioned separately. For example, monks. Form is impermanent, feeling is impermanent, perception is impermanent, volitional formations are impermanent, consciousness is impermanent, form is subject to pressure, feeling is subject to pressure, perception is subject to pressure, volitional formations are subject to pressure, consciousness is subject to pressure. Form is non-self, feeling is non-self, perception is non-self, volitional formations are non-self, consciousness is non-self. Although there is a term in Pali that translates as three characteristics, namely tini lakanani, it refers to distinct groups of characteristics. The closest group to this context contains the three characteristics of conditioned phenomena, Sankata Dhamma, Upada Lakkhana, the characteristic of arising, Vaya Lakkhana, the characteristic of passing away, and Tana Tatta Lakkhana, the characteristic of abiding and becoming otherwise. But this group has its own collective term, i.e. Sankata Lakkhana. The term Samana Lakkhana, universal characteristics, likewise is not an original term from the Tipitaka, but it is used frequently in the commentaries. It is used for comparison, describing how all things are endowed with two kinds of attributes. Unique attributes, Pachata Lakkhana, and shared attributes, Saman Lakkhana. For example, a unique attribute of a physical form, Rupa, that is, it is under strain, and a unique attribute of feeling, Vedana, is that it feels sense impressions, but from form and feeling share the attributes of impermanence, dukkha, and non-self. The term Visesa Lakkhana, unique characteristic, special characteristic, is occasionally used in place of Pachata Lakkhana. In this case, the same distinction is made between unique characteristics and universal characteristics. There are other similar distinctions occurring in the scriptures. For example, ultimate truths, Paramatta Dhamma, are endowed with two attributes of an individual nature, Sabhava Lakkhana, and universal attributes, Samanana Lakkhana. Attributes of an individual nature are sometimes referred to simply as individual attributes, Salakhana. Direct knowledge, Abhinya, is a unique kind of wisdom, the function of which is to understand the individual attributes of things, Sabhava Lakkhana. It may also be translated as penetrative knowledge. It is equivalent to Abhijnana. Note that this is not the same definition of Abhinya used to denote the 5 or 6 kinds of supreme knowledge. By understanding clearly with direct knowledge, one has reached an initial stage of thorough knowledge, Parinya, called knowledge of recognition, nata parinya. The understanding of universal attributes, on the other hand, is the function of wisdom called investigative knowledge, tirana parinya. Note also that the term samana lakkhana, universal characteristics, is not fixed to the principles of impermanence, dukkha and non-self. For example, it is sometimes stated in the scriptures that all formations, sankhara, possess the universal characteristic of existing according to causes and conditions. These three terms, aniccatta, dukkhata and anattata, in this particular grammatical structure, do not appear anywhere in the Tipitaka as a group. Instead, they are used separately according to different circumstances. Although the term aniccatta is found fairly frequently in the Tipitaka, it is most often used while explaining the breaking up of material things, rupadhamma, including in the context of physical death, marana. It is never used explicitly by the Buddha himself. It is used by Venerable Sariputta and by other disciples, and in explanations within the Abhidhamma. The term dukkhata was used by the Buddha, but only in the context of three kinds of dukkha: dukkha, dukkhata, sankhara dukkhata, and viparinama dukkhata. The term anattata does not appear anywhere in the Tipitaka. Because the commentators regularly mentioned and explained this collection of three factors, they came up with a convenient abbreviation to refer to them, by simply adding the term adi, beginning with, to aniccatta. Example: aniccatta di patisamyuttam, aniccatta di lakkhana-tayam, aniccatta di vasena, aniccatta di samanan lakkhanam, and aniccatta dinam. Only in the sub-commentaries were these three terms combined into a distinct group, although even here this presentation is not common. D. Terms pertaining to specific conditionality, ida paccayata. The principle of the first law of nature, cited above, is acknowledged to be profound and extremely difficult to understand. From an initial and incomprehensive explanation, it appears that this principle was almost not mentioned at all in traditional Thai texts and literary works. Only in the last century was it included in formal Dhamma educational systems, and at the beginning of this period the most popular term for this principle was Paticcasamuppada. As far as I can discern, the reason why in scholarly circles this principle was specifically referred to as Paticcasamuppada stems from Somdet Pra Maha Samana Chau Krom Praya Vajranan Varo Rasa, establishing the system of Dhamma studies known as Naktam. He wrote an explanation of Paticcasamuppada in the book titled Dhamma Vibhanga Paricheda Volume 2, which is assigned to second level Naktam students in Dhamma studies, Pariyatti Dhamma. The term Paticcasamuppada appears frequently in the Tipitaka, the commentaries and the sub-commentaries. It is thus apt that students of Buddhism are familiar with it. It is noteworthy, however, that ida paccayata, which is a key term in this context, it usually accompanies and precedes the term Paticcasamuppada. seems to have gone unnoticed. This seems to indicate that those students engaged in this recent system of Dhamma studies did not extend their research beyond the course books assigned to them. Only within the past 50 years did this later term become more prominent. As far as I can gather, the reason for this resurgence stems from Venerable Buddhadasa Bhikkhu's determined teachings on this principle, along with his frequent emphasis on the term ida paccayayata. There were two occasions when the Buddha mentioned this term ida paccayayata. First, soon after his awakening, he stated that ordinary people would find it extremely difficult to understand the truth that he had realized, and therefore it would cause him hardship to try and teach it to them. The second time he mentioned this term was in his frequent exposition of this first law of nature. Apart from these occasions, the term only appears in the two forms of ida paccayaya and ida paccayayata Paticcasamuppada. The term paccayakara, mode of conditionality, which is another synonym for Paticcasamuppada and is included in the second level Naktam textbooks, was coined later. It does not appear in the main body of the Sutta Pitaka. It first appears in the Abhidhamma, which is a later addition to the collection of suttas. The term appears twice in the same section, in a heading and in the text, describing the biography of Venerable Kemateri, the chief bhikkhuni disciple of the Buddha, who sat at his right-hand side and was foremost in wisdom. Although the Vinaya Pitaka contains a lengthy biography of the Buddha, beginning with the period after his awakening, when he was experiencing the bliss of deliverance and contemplating the law of dependent origination, there is no mention in the entire Tipitaka of this term paccayakara. The Abhidhamma contains a lengthy section, the Vibhanga, approximately 75 pages, devoted entirely to the subject of dependent origination, but nowhere in this text does the word paccayakara appear, nor does the term Paticcasamuppada appear in this text. There are only references to phenomena being conditionally arisen, Paticcasamuppada, or specifically conditioned and conditionally arisen, ida paccayayata Paticcasamuppada. The terms appear here only in headings which later compilers of this text created, and these headings differ according to various editions. The Thai Sayamrata edition contains the heading Paccayakara Vibhango, while the Burmese Chatta Sangiti edition contains the heading Paticcasamuppada Vibhango. In sum, the word most often used in the Tipitaka for this law of nature is Paticcasamuppada, occurring either on its own or in conjunction with ida paccayayata. Most of these references occur in the Sutta Pitaka. Only seldom is this word used in the Vinaya Pitaka. In the Abhidhamma, it occurs explicitly only in the Katavatu. Apart from this, the Dhamma Sangani contains the word Paticcasamuppada Kusalata, and there is a single passage in the Dhatu Kata. At the end of the tabulated summary, Matika. with an interesting sequence of qualities. Panchakanda Dvadasa Yatanani Atarasa Tatuyo Chatari Sachani Bhavi Santi Diriyani Paticcasamuppada Kataro Satipanya Kataro Samapadana Kataro Idipada. Beginning with the commentaries, the terms Paticcasamuppada and Paccayakara were used frequently. The term Ida Paccayayata was also used, but less frequently. Another interesting observation is that stemming from the combined terms Dhammatitata, Dhammaniyamata, which together constitute a name for this law of nature, there was derived another important term, Dhammatiti Nana, which appears in the Buddha's words, Dhammatiti Nanam Pube Paccaya Nibbane Jnanam. No knowledge of consistency first, knowledge of Nibbana afterwards, or endowed first with knowledge of constancy, knowledge of Nibbana ensues. The Buddha spoke these words to Venerable Susima, who had previously been a religious wanderer, Paticcasamuppada, and had asked to be ordained in the Buddhist Dhamma and discipline. He maintained the misunderstanding that arahants must all be endowed with psychic powers, for instance the divine ear and the divine eye. The Buddha spoke this passage to free him from his misunderstanding and to explain to him that those arahants who are liberated by way of wisdom, panya vimutta, realize full awakening by generating knowledge of constancy, dhammatitiyana, followed by knowledge of nibbana, without requiring any sort of psychic powers. Knowledge of constancy, Dhammatiti Jnana, is equivalent to an insight into these laws of nature. The clear understanding that all phenomena as part of the five aggregates are impermanent, dukkha and non-self, and that they are mutually conditioned, giving rise to results within the origination cycle of dependent origination. Eventually, one discerns to end the causes and conditions within the origination cycle and realizes the cessation cycle, culminating in a realization of Nibbana. Although, according to the Buddha's words above, the knowledge of constancy, Dhammatitiyana, encompasses both the insight into the three characteristics and into dependent origination, culminating in the completion of the cessation cycle. Concise explanations. Example, in the description of the 77 kinds of knowledge, jnana, found in the very same volume, the Buddha mentions or emphasizes only dependent origination, the origination cycle. In later texts of the Tipitaka, the knowledge of constancy, Dhammatitiyana, was more frequently mentioned, and its meaning or emphasis was associated specifically with dependent origination. The Paticcasamuppada, for instance, defines it as wisdom that comprehends conditioning factors, paccaya parigaha. This knowledge was later referred to as paccaya pariyagahanana, Dhammatitiyana, or paccaya parigahayana, or paccaya yakarayana, is also frequently mentioned and explained in the commentaries and sub-commentaries. For example, in these texts, it is equivalent with purity of transcending doubts. Kan kavitarana visuddhi, It is sometimes called knowledge according to reality. Yata Bhuta Yana, right vision, Sama Dasana, or insight knowledge, Vipassana Yana. It is occasionally described as knowledge reaching the pinnacle of insight into specific conditionality, Ida Pachaya Yata. The knowledge of Nibbana, Nibbana Yana, is equated with path knowledge, Magga Yana. E. All-encompassing principles of truth. In the Buddha's own words, describing his awakening, he outlined the two truths that he had realized. This appears very clearly in his reflection several weeks after his awakening, when he states that he had realized Ida Pachaya Yata Paticcasamuppada and Nibbana, truths that go against the stream and are difficult for ordinary people to understand. Consequently, he was disinclined to teach the Dhamma. In the Vinaya Pitaka, the Buddha describes the events after his awakening, after which time he experienced the bliss of liberation under the Bodhi tree, taught the first sermon, acquired his first disciples, performed various ordinations resulting in the creation of the monastic community, Sangha, and finally established the monastic discipline. The Buddha's reflection cited above occurred, according to the commentarial account, after he had enjoyed the bliss of liberation for 7 weeks, and before he departed from the place of awakening in order to teach the Dhamma in the deer park at Isipatana near the city of Varanasi. Let us go back to the beginning of this period. During the first night of experiencing the bliss of liberation, he gave 3 inspired utterances, one during each of the 3 watches of the night. Here he contemplates dependent origination, both in its forward and reverse sequences. Paticcasamuppadam anuloma patilomam mana sa kasi. Note that here the term Paticcasamuppada appears alone, without the accompanying term Ida Pachaya Yata. In contrast to later teachings, here the Buddha does not clearly name the truths that he had realized, but it is not difficult to discern that he is using synonyms for dependent origination and Nibbana. Verse number 1. When truths manifest to a purified one, diligent and meditative, all doubts vanish away, since he knows the truth together with its cause. Sahetu Dhamma equals suffering and its origin. Verse 2. When truths manifest to a purified one, diligent and meditative, all doubts vanish away, since he has realized the cessation of conditioning factors. Kayam Pachayanam equals Nibbana. Verse number 3. When truths manifest to a purified one, diligent and meditative, then he dispels Mara and his forces, and remains like the sun illuminating the sky. The gist of the verse is the forward sequence anuloma of dependent origination, which is sometimes referred to in the commentaries as the origination cycle, samudaya vara. This verse reveals the origin of suffering, the process of causes and conditions giving rise to suffering, In other words, it describes suffering along with its causes. The gist of the second verse is the reverse sequence, Paticcasamuppada, of dependent origination, which is sometimes referred to in the commentaries as the cessation cycle, Nirodha Vara. This verse reveals the cessation of suffering, Dukkha Nirodha, the state free from suffering, the state in which no renewed suffering arises, due to the exhaustion of all causes and conditions that lead to suffering. This refers to the end of dependent origination, to Nibbana. The third verse describes the state of awakening, the state of one who has realized cessation, realized Nibbana, one whose wisdom is clear, spacious and free. The commentaries explain that this verse describes the splendor and majesty of the noble path, Arya Magga. This collection of 3 inspired verses points to and explains the same truths expressed in the Buddha's later reflection cited above. They reveal how the practice for reaching the goal of Buddhism, for realizing the supreme truth of Nibbana, requires a comprehension of this first law of nature, Dhamma Niyama, i.e. the law of dependent origination. In this way one realizes 2 levels of truth which encompass all things, namely the truth of all conditioned phenomena and the supreme truth, Parama Satya, of the unconditioned. It is important to reiterate that a realization of this first law of nature is combined with and equivalent to an understanding of the remaining 3 laws of nature, of impermanence, dukkha and non-self. There are many passages in the Suttanta Pitaka in which the Buddha recounts his going forth and his spiritual exertions up to the time of his awakening. A key passage in this context pertains to the time when he was awakened. When my mind was concentrated, I directed it to knowledge of the destruction of the taints. I directly knew as it actually is. This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. I directly knew as it actually is. These are the taints. This is the origin of the taints. This is the cessation of the taints. This is the way leading to the cessation of the taints. When I knew and saw thus, my mind was liberated. This passage indicates clearly that the Buddha realized the 4 Noble Truths at the time of his awakening. This may seem to be at variance with the passages cited above, but when one analyzes these different passages carefully, one sees that they refer essentially to the same thing. Technically, the 4 Noble Truths are comprised of 2 pairs of truths, Dukkha and Samudaya, and Nirodha and Magga. According to the Buddha's first sermon, the Dhammachaka Tana Sutra, which in the Vinaya Pitaka follows on from the Buddha's reflections cited earlier, Samudaya, origin, refers to the 3 kinds of craving, tanha, and nirodha, cessation, refers to the renouncing, abandoning, and cessation of all such craving to complete liberation. At first glance, one may not yet see the connection here to the natural law of dependent origination. Craving, tanha, is a vital factor in the forward sequence of dependent origination, or the cycle of origination, resulting in suffering. The first and second Noble Truths thus exist as a pair. The reverse sequence of dependent origination, the cycle of cessation, is the dissolution of all conditioning factors within the dynamic of suffering, the end of dependent origination. This corresponds to cessation, Nirodha, the third noble truth. The fourth noble truth, the path, Magga, is a formal method of spiritual practice established for people to give rise to the natural process of reverse sequence. The path is thus included in the reverse sequence of dependent origination. This is a very brief summary of how these principles are interlinked. The commentaries provide another classification of laws of nature, which can be designated as a subdivision of natural laws. They use the term niyama to refer to these laws, consisting of 5 factors. 1. Utu niyama, laws pertaining to the material world, in particular to those dynamics in the natural environment related to temperature. 2. Bija niyama, laws pertaining to heredity. 3. Shita niyama, laws pertaining to the functions of the mind. 4. Kama niyama, law of kama. 5. Dhamma niyama, the law of the interrelation between causes and conditions, in particular to those laws operating independently according to nature. Example, those things relying on conditions for their existence must naturally come to an end. Stream enterers are naturally beyond spiritual regression, etc. Although this 5th factor of Dhamma Niyama is a key principle in the teachings, which was explained frequently by the Buddha, and for which there are numerous examples, it is surprising that the commentators in this context do not explain it in the same way. In their explanations, they simply refer to the normal attributes of a bodhisattva. For example, when a bodhisattva is conceived, born and awakened, it is normal for the 10,000 world system to shake. When a bodhisattva enters his mother's womb, it is natural that she is endowed with virtue and free from any illness. In the Mahapadana Sutta, which lists 16 general rules pertaining to the circumstances of a bodhisattva, the term Dhammata is used, rather than Dhamma Niyama. Although these two terms are synonymous, their meanings are not identical, they simply overlap.